Welcome to Nachtmeier Witness. Some nights feel wrong before anything happens. The air feels heavy, the room feels colder, and somewhere in the dark, you get the strange feeling that you are being watched. Tonight, you will hear stories from people who became witnesses to things they never expected to see. Some saw someone standing in the shadows. Some heard voices with no one nearby. Others found themselves in places that did not feel real at all. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a slow, dark atmosphere, subscribe to Nachtmeier Witness. Get comfortable. The night has already begun. I might be a little late sharing this story, and it's not about ghosts or murderers or anything that dramatic. No one died. No one vanished. But it's still one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had. It happened when I was a sit at a Girl Scout day camp that was held at a Boy Scout campground. Officially, it was a day camp, but the counselors and CITs stayed overnight the entire week. So once you were there, you were there. No going home at night, no real break from the place, just woods, cabins, and a whole lot of quiet after dark. First, I want to say that I don't mean any disrespect to current or former Boy Scouts. My brother is one, and my dad was one too. I know the organization has traditions and ceremonies that are meaningful to a lot of people. But being there, in that environment, not fully understanding everything that went on behind the scenes, it all felt strange to me. Strange enough that it stuck in my memory for years. It was maybe the third evening of camp. The sun was starting to sink, but it wasn't fully dark yet. That in-between time where everything is still visible, but slowly fading into shadow. My friend, who I'll call Martha, and I decided to go for a walk. She was 2 years older than me, but also a sit. So we were kind of equals in that weird middle ground between camper and full counselor. We had already seen most of the main campground area. We had been given a tour at the beginning of the week, and I'd been there before as a younger camper, so nothing in the central area was new. But there were trails branching off into the woods in several places, and curiosity got the better of us. We were technically staff, so in our minds, we weren't going to get in trouble for exploring a little. It felt harmless. We headed down a narrow trail that went past the ropes course. At first, it was beautiful, honestly peaceful. The trees were tall and thick, stretching high above us. The ground was covered in pine needles and leaves. We passed a couple of small creeks that looked like something out of a postcard. Water trickling over stones, reflecting the fading light. It felt calm, almost magical. Every so often we noticed tire tracks in the dirt. That slightly broke the illusion of being deep in untouched wilderness. The staff at the camp drove everywhere. Trucks and utility vehicles were constantly going back and forth. It always felt a little odd to see car tracks in the middle of what was supposed to be a camping experience. But it wasn't exactly creepy, just mildly annoying. After walking for a while, we came across a campsite that I mostly recognized. From what I knew, it looked like an ordeal site. The ordeal is part of the Boy Scouts' Order of the Arrow program. From what my brother had explained before, it's basically a test of endurance and dedication. You build a shelter. You chop wood. You stay mostly silent. You barely eat. I think they're given a boiled egg and water for the day. It's meant to teach humility and service. The campsite we found fit that description. There was a very strange-looking shelter made of branches and leaves with what looked like a bed of piled leaves inside. There were chopped logs scattered around. The place looked used but temporary. It didn't feel like a regular camping setup. It felt like something constructed for a specific purpose. and then abandoned. Martha immediately started joking about serial killers and cult rituals. That was her way of dealing with anything that made her slightly uncomfortable. I tried to stay rational. I reminded her about the ordeal. I explained that it made sense given the setup. There was nothing truly threatening about it, just different. We looked around for a few minutes, but didn't see anything else interesting. So we kept walking, following the main trail farther into the woods. That's when Martha spotted something. A very small footpath branched off from the main trail. It was narrow, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. The trees in that area weren't as dense, and through them we could see what looked like a clearing up ahead. Against our better judgment, we decided to check it out. Martha, being Martha, immediately ran ahead out of curiosity. I couldn't run. I was born with this weird issue where my knees don't bend properly, and running is painful. Most of the time it hurts like hell. So I followed as quickly as I could without actually running. As I walked, I tried to think logically about what the clearing could be. Another campsite maybe. Storage, some kind of staff area. I didn't expect anything dramatic. When I finally reached the clearing, Martha had stopped in the center and was just standing there. The clearing itself wasn't huge, but it was deliberate. It didn't feel natural, like a random break in the trees. It felt made, like someone had intentionally cleared that space. The first thing I noticed were these strange metal bar structures planted in the ground around part of the clearing. They were evenly spaced and shaped in a way that made Martha immediately say they looked like candle holders, tall enough that you could place something on top of them. Now here's where context matters. Earlier in the week, I had told Martha about a camp legend. Supposedly, years ago, there had been rumors of Satanists in the area performing weird ceremonies in the woods. It was probably just a story passed down from bored teenagers trying to scare younger campers. The legend involved candles and chanting and all the usual dramatic details. So when Martha saw those metal bar things, her mind jumped straight to that story. She looked at me wide-eyed like this was confirmation of everything. I told her to calm down. It was probably part of some Boy Scout ceremony or activity. Maybe they used lanterns or torches. It didn't automatically mean anything sinister. The rest of the clearing looked fairly plain. There was a fire pit in the center and some logs placed around it like seats. No tent, no shelter, nothing that screamed active campsite. It felt more like a meeting place. Then I noticed something in the fire pit. The logs inside it were covered in glitter. Not ash, not weird residue, actual craft glitter. The kind kids use on birthday cards and art projects. Bright colors, silver, pink, blue, green, it sparkled in the fading light. I remember staring at it because it just didn't make sense. Who brings glitter into the middle of the woods? Who dumps glitter on logs in a fire pit? It wasn't subtle either. It wasn't like a few stray specks. It looked like someone had poured handfuls of glitter over the wood. I was about to say something when we heard it, rustling, not from one direction, from all around the clearing. Leaves shifting, branches moving, the sound of something moving through the trees. But it wasn't coming from the direction of the footpath we had entered from. It was everywhere else. Martha swears to this day that the trees were shaking. I don't know if I'd go that far, but I do remember the sound being loud enough that it made my stomach drop. There was no wind, not even a breeze. The air felt completely still, almost heavy. The rustling didn't sound like one small animal. It sounded like movement in multiple spots at once, like something circling, or several somethings. We froze. Neither of us spoke. We just listened. The glitter caught the last bits of light and shimmered strangely in the fire pit. The metal bars stood silent around us. The rustling continued for several long seconds that felt much longer. That's when survival instinct kicked in. Without discussing it, we both turned and walked quickly back toward the footpath. We didn't run, I couldn't anyway, but we moved as fast as we could. The moment we stepped back onto the main trail, the rustling seemed to fade. We didn't look back. We didn't joke anymore either. The playful tone we had earlier was gone. We walked in silence until we reached the familiar part of camp. Later that night, lying in my bunk, I kept replaying it. The glitter, the metal bars, the clearing, the rustling in all directions. I tried to come up with explanation. Maybe the glitter was from a craft activity that somehow ended up there. Maybe staff had held some kind of ceremony or themed event. Maybe animals were moving through the woods at the same time. But what made it stick with me was how intentional the clearing felt, how deliberate the setup looked, and how the woods seemed to come alive the moment we noticed the glitter. Nothing followed us. Nothing jumped out. No one ever mentioned that site officially. And we never went back to look for it again. To this day, I don't think it was anything supernatural. I don't think it was Satanists or ghosts or secret cults. But I do know that sometimes, when you step off the main trail and into a place that isn't meant for you, the woods have a way of reminding you. And that clearing, with its glitter-covered fire pit and metal stands, felt like a place we weren't supposed to see. I was 12 years old when this happened, and even after all these years, I still remember every sound from that night, as if it is trapped somewhere in the back of my head. My father and I were driving across the country, just the two of us, passing through Texas on a long stretch of road that seemed to go on forever. There was nothing around us for miles except dry land, open sky, and the kind of silence that makes you feel small. During the day, that part of Texas looked empty but peaceful. The road stretched ahead like a gray ribbon, the sun burned low over the fields, and every now and then we would pass a rusted fence, an old sign, or a patch of land where cattle stood still in the heat. But as the afternoon began to fade and the sky turned darker, that same emptiness started to feel different. It stopped feeling quiet and started feeling abandoned. We had been driving for hours when the car began acting strange. At first it was just a rough sound under the hood, a kind of coughing rattle that made my father glance down at the dashboard. He didn't say much, but I noticed the way his jaw tightened. A few minutes later, the car jerked once, then again, and then the engine gave a low, tired groan. My father guided it to the side of the road, and we rolled to a stop near a patch of dirt and dead grass. When he turned the key again, the engine tried to start, sputtered, and died. He tried a second time, then a third, but each time it sounded worse. Finally, he sat back, rubbed a hand over his face, and looked out through the windshield at the empty road ahead of us. I remember asking him if we were going to be okay. He gave me that calm look fathers give their children when they don't want them to be scared, even though they are already thinking about every bad thing that could happen. He told me we were fine, that it was probably something small, and that we would just have to find a phone. This was before cell phones were something everyone carried, and out there, in the middle of nowhere, we had no easy way to call for help. The sun was getting lower, and with every passing minute the land around us turned more shadowy. My father stepped out of the car, lifted the hood, and stared into the engine like he might be able to force it back to life just by looking at it. After a while, he shut the hood with a heavy thud and looked around. There was only one house we could see. It sat far off the road, up a little rise, with a long dirt path leading toward it. Even from where we stood, it looked old. Not just old like a house that had been there for a long time, but old in a way that made it seem forgotten. The paint was faded, The porch leaned slightly, and the windows looked dark even though there was still a little daylight left. There were no other houses nearby, no stores, no gas station, no signs of traffic that might stop and help us. Just that house. Before we started walking, my father opened the glove compartment and took out his .45. I had seen the gun before, but I had never seen him handle it the way he did that evening. He checked it quietly, then tucked it into the waistband of his pants and pulled his shirt over it. That was when I became truly nervous. My father was not a fearful man. He was careful, yes, but not easily shaken. So seeing him take the gun with him told me that he didn't like the situation any more than I did. We walked toward the house as the light drained from the sky. The dirt path crunched under our shoes. I remember the air feeling too still. There were no birds calling, no dogs barking, no wind moving through the brush. The closer we got, the more the house seemed to grow out of the darkness. A single yellowish light burned somewhere inside, but it didn't make the place look welcoming. It made it look worse, like something was waiting behind those windows. My father knocked on the front door. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then we heard slow footsteps from inside. The door opened just enough for an old man to look out at us. He was thin, with a long face, deep lines around his mouth, and pale eyes that seemed to study us without blinking. I remember thinking he looked creepy, though at 12 years old I didn't have better words for it. He didn't smile. He didn't seem surprised to see us either. He just stood there in the doorway while my father explained that our car had broken down and that we needed to call a mechanic or a tow truck. The old man listened in silence. Then he opened the door wider and told us we could use his phone. His voice was dry and low, like it hurt him to speak. We stepped inside, and right away I noticed the smell of the house. It smelled like dust, old wood, and something damp underneath it all. Like a basement that had been closed for years. The walls were covered with old wallpaper that had started to peel in the corners. There were framed pictures hanging in the hallway, but the faces in them were hard to see in the dim light. The furniture looked ancient and heavy, the kind of furniture that seemed like it had never been moved. The old man led my father to the phone, and I stood close by, looking around, while trying not to look too scared. My father made the call and explained where we were as best as he could. After a few minutes, he hung up. The old man told us no one would be able to come out until morning. The road was too far, the hour was getting too late, and the mechanic would not make the trip until daylight. My father didn't like that answer, I could tell, but we didn't have much choice. We couldn't sleep in the car safely, not with the temperature dropping and the road so empty. The old man said we could stay in the spare bedroom for the night. My father thanked him, though his voice sounded guarded. The old man led us down a hallway to a small bedroom near the back of the house. It had 2 narrow beds, a dresser, and a window with thin curtains. The room was plain, and the air inside felt cold. There was a bathroom connected to it, which made me feel a little better for some reason, as if having another door nearby gave me an escape. The old man told us we could rest there, and that he would wake us when the mechanic arrived in the morning. Then he left, closing the door behind him. For a while, neither of us said anything. My father listened at the door. Then he walked over to one of the beds, took the gun from his waistband, and placed it under his pillow. He told me to get some sleep. I asked him if everything was okay. He looked at me for a second, then said yes, but his face didn't match his words. He told me we were just being careful. I climbed into the other bed and pulled the blanket up to my chest. The room was quiet except for the old house settling around us. Every creak made me open my eyes. Every shift of the floorboards made me wonder if someone was standing outside the door. But I was exhausted. We had been on the road for a long time, and fear can wear a person down almost as much as sleepiness. Eventually, my eyes closed. I must have fallen asleep quickly, because the next thing I remember is waking up in the dark to a sound I will never forget. It was a deep, heavy banging, slow and steady. Thud. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The sound seemed too strange to be real. It was not like someone knocking on a door. It was not like footsteps either. It was heavier than that, deeper, like something large being dropped against the floor over and over again. The whole house seemed to answer each hit with a faint tremble. I lay there frozen, staring into the darkness, my heart already starting to beat fast. My father was awake too. I heard him sit up sharply. The mattress creaked, and then I saw his shape in the dark reaching under the pillow. He pulled out the gun and whispered my name. I answered in a small voice. He told me to stay in bed and not move. Then he got up and went to the door. The sound continued. Thud, thud. It was coming from somewhere inside the house. My father opened the bedroom door slowly and looked into the hall. I could see only a strip of darkness beyond him. He stepped out. I stayed in bed for maybe 3 seconds before fear got the better of me. The thought of being left alone in that room was worse than disobeying him. I slipped out from under the blanket and followed him, trying to walk as quietly as I could. He turned and saw me behind him. Even in the dark, I could tell he was angry and scared, but he didn't shout. He just put one finger to his lips and motioned for me to stay close behind him. We moved down the hallway together, following the sound. The house looked completely different at night. The same hallway that had seemed old and dusty earlier now felt narrow and alive. Shadows pooled in the corners. The wallpaper looked like dead skin in the dim light. The framed pictures on the walls seemed to watch us as we passed. My father held the gun in both hands, pointed downward, but ready. I stayed behind him, gripping the back of his shirt like I had when I was little. The banging grew louder as we walked. Thud, thud, thud. I could feel it under my feet now. Not just hear it, feel it. Each impact sent a small vibration through the floorboards. It seemed to be coming from behind a door at the end of the hall, a door I had not noticed before. It was plain and narrow, with a dark metal knob. My father stopped in front of it and listened. For a moment the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Then, from behind the door, it came again. Thud. This time it was so loud that I flinched. My father reached for the knob. I wanted to tell him not to open it. I wanted to pull him back and beg him to return to the room and wait until morning. But I couldn't speak. My throat felt closed. He turned the knob slowly and opened the door just a few inches. Beyond it was a stairway leading down into darkness. The smell that came up from below was cold and rotten, like wet dirt and old wood. There was no light down there. The stairs disappeared into blackness after only a few steps. My father pushed the door open a little wider and leaned forward, trying to see. The gun was raised now. The sound came again, much louder. Thud, thud, thud. It was coming from the basement. Then I saw movement. At first I could not understand what I was looking at. Something big and blocky moved at the bottom of the stairs. It did not walk. It did not crawl. It hopped. Each time it lifted and dropped, the whole house seemed to shake. Thud. It came closer. Thud. Another step up. Thud. My mind could not make sense of it. It was too dark to see clearly, but whatever it was large, square, and black. It moved in a stiff, unnatural way, rising and dropping as if pulled by invisible hands. I peeked around my father's side, and for one terrible second, I saw it moving up the stairs toward us. My father cursed under his breath and slammed the door shut so hard the frame rattled. Then he grabbed my arm and pulled me back down the hall. We ran. I stumbled once, almost falling, but he yanked me up and kept moving. Behind us, from the other side of that basement door, the banging continued. Thud, thud, thud. We made it back to the spare bedroom. My father shut the door and locked it. Then he dragged the dresser in front of it, pushing with all his strength. I stood near the bed, shaking so badly I could barely breathe. My father pointed the gun at the door and told me to get into the bathroom. I didn't move at first. I was too terrified to leave him. He turned his head just enough to look at me and yelled for me to lock myself in the bathroom now. That broke through my fear. I ran into the bathroom and locked the door. It was small and cold, with a sink, a toilet, and an old bathtub with a stained curtain pulled halfway across it. There was a tiny window above the tub, but it was too small for me to climb through. I pressed my back against the far wall and listened. For a while, there was only the banging in the distance. Thud, thud, thud. It was moving through the house, coming closer. I heard my father breathing hard in the bedroom. I heard the floorboards outside the room begin to shake. The banging was in the hallway now. Thud, thud, thud. Then it stopped right outside our bedroom door. The silence stretched on. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I wanted to cover them, but I was afraid to move. I wanted to call out to my father, but I was afraid to make a sound. On the other side of the bathroom door, my father stood waiting with his gun pointed at whatever was in the hall. Then came the crash. It was not a normal crash. It sounded like the entire bedroom door had exploded inward. Wood splintered. Something heavy slammed against the wall. The dresser screeched across the floor and toppled over. I heard pieces of broken wood scatter across the room. My father shouted, and in his voice I heard pure terror. Oh my God. Then the banging started again, now inside the room. Thud, thud, thud. My father fired the gun. The sound was deafening in that small house. One shot, then another, then another. I screamed and dropped to the bathroom floor, covering my head. He kept firing, but the thing did not stop. Thud, thud, thud. The shots rang out again and again until they blurred together. Then I heard my father make a sound I had never heard from him before. It was not a word. It was a broken, panicked cry, the sound of a man seeing something his mind could not accept. Then came the scream. It was awful. It was the kind of scream that does not sound human at first, because it carries too much pain. It tore through the room and through me. I knew it was my father, and that knowledge destroyed something inside me. The scream turned into a choking sound, and then I heard cracks. Wet, heavy cracks. The sound of bones being crushed. I pressed both hands over my mouth to stop myself from crying out. Tears ran down my face. My whole body shook. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to wake up in the car on the road and find out none of it had happened. But the sounds kept coming. Something dragged or shifted in the bedroom. Then there was silence. For a few seconds, I thought maybe it was over. Then I heard it again. Thud, thud, thud. It was coming toward the bathroom door. I backed away until I hit the bathtub. There was nowhere else to go. The bathroom door trembled with each impact from outside. I looked around wildly for anything I could use. There was a toothbrush, a bar of soap, a towel, a rusted plunger near the toilet. Nothing that could help me. Nothing that could stop whatever had just broken through the bedroom door and killed my father. The doorknob shook once. Then the door burst inward. Pieces of wood flew past me. One sharp piece cut my arm, but I barely felt it. I was staring at the doorway. Standing there was a coffin, a big black coffin. It was upright, dark and solid, with edges that looked worn and old. There were no legs beneath it, no person carrying it, no strings, no reason it should have been able to move. But it did. It hopped forward, lifting itself slightly off the floor and crashing back down. Thud, it came into the bathroom. Thud, closer thud, I could not move. My mind was screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to run to. The coffin filled the doorway, blocking the only exit. Its black surface seemed to swallow what little light there was. I could see scratches along its sides, deep marks like something had clawed at it from the inside. It hopped toward me again. Thud, the bathroom floor shook. I climbed backward into the bathtub, slipping on the smooth porcelain. My hand hit the wall, then the faucet, then something small on the edge of this. My fingers closed around it without thinking. Cough syrup. A bottle of cough syrup. I stared at it for half a second, too terrified to understand why my hand had found it. The coffin hopped closer, looming over the tub. Thud, I did the only thing my panicked mind could think to do. I threw the bottle at it. The glass hit the coffin and shattered. Thick red syrup splashed across the black wood. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the coffin stopped. It trembled once. Then it leaned back slightly, as if the hit had shocked it. A low groan came from inside it, deep and hollow. The red syrup slid down its surface in slow lines. The coffin shuddered again. Then it turned away. Thud, it hopped back toward the broken bathroom door. Thud, into the bedroom. Thud, down the hallway. I stayed in the bathtub, crying and shaking, listening as the sound moved farther and farther away. Thud, thud, thud. Then, somewhere deep in the house, it faded into silence. I do not remember much after that. I know I stayed in that bathroom until morning. I know that when the first light came through the small window, I was still curled in the tub, holding my knees to my chest. I know people eventually came. The mechanic, the police, someone. I remember voices shouting. I remember being carried out of the house. I remember refusing to look into the bedroom. No one ever gave me an answer that made sense. Some people said shock had twisted my memory. Some said there had been an intruder. Some said a child's mind could invent things when it was afraid. But I know what I heard. I know what came up those basement stairs. And the worst part is, even now, all these years later, sometimes I wake in the middle of the night and hear it again in my head. I've never really liked talking about this story because technically nothing terrible happened. Nobody got hurt, nobody disappeared. There were no ghosts, monsters, or masked killers hiding in the woods. But even now, years later, it still creeps me out more than a lot of stories involving actual violence. Maybe it's because of how strange and quiet it all was. Maybe it's because to this day I still can't fully explain what that old woman was trying to do. Or maybe it's because for a few seconds, standing in that parking lot in the middle of nowhere, I genuinely felt like something was deeply wrong. This happened right after my 18th birthday. My best friend, who I'll call Gilbert, had his birthday about a week before mine. So, we had both just crossed into that weird stage of life where you suddenly feel like an adult, even though you still have no clue what you're doing. We thought turning 18 meant freedom. We thought it meant we were experienced and mature now. Looking back, we were still just dumb teenagers trying way too hard to act older than we were. That weekend, Gilbert, his older brother, and I had gone on a canoe trip. It was one of those cheap little outdoor adventures we planned because we were bored and wanted to do something memorable before summer ended. We spent 2 days paddling down muddy rivers, sleeping in tents, eating terrible food cooked over a fire, and trying to convince ourselves we were rugged outdoorsmen instead of suburban kids pretending to be tough. By the time we packed everything up and started heading home, we were exhausted, sunburned, dirty, and smelling like smoke and river water. Gilbert's older brother drove most of the way back, while Gilbert and I half slept in the car. We were traveling along Interstate 80, which, if you've ever driven parts of it through the Midwest, can feel endless. Long stretches of highway, flat land, truck stops every few exits, the kind of drive where your brain starts to go numb from staring at the road too long. At some point during the trip home, Gilbert suddenly sat upright and pointed out the window. "There it is," he said. I looked over and saw a giant sign rising above the highway, Lion's Den. Even from the interstate, it was impossible to miss. Bright colors, flashy lights, and that unmistakable look that screamed adult store without actually needing to say it directly. Gilbert and I looked at each other immediately. We both started laughing because, honestly, we were 18-year-old idiots, and the idea of finally being legally allowed into one of those places felt hilarious and exciting. Neither of us had ever been inside an adult video store before. We had seen them from the highway our whole lives, usually while traveling with parents who pretended they didn't exist. They always seemed mysterious in a trashy kind of way. Forbidden when you were younger. Now suddenly we could walk right in. Gilbert's older brother wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. He groaned the second we suggested stopping. "You guys are pathetic," he said. Which, to be fair, we probably were. But after enough begging and joking around, he finally agreed to pull off the highway. He said he'd wait in the car while we embarrassed ourselves inside. Gilbert and I acted like we were heading into some legendary adult wonderland. The parking lot itself should have been the first sign that the place was weird. It was bigger than I expected, but strangely empty. A few semi-trucks were parked along the edge near the back. There were maybe 3 or 4 regular cars scattered around the lot, all parked far apart from each other, like everyone there wanted maximum privacy. The building sat by itself near the highway, surrounded by open land, glowing under harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look pale and artificial. I remember feeling oddly nervous as we walked toward the entrance. We were laughing, but it was nervous laughter, the kind where you're trying to act confident even though you feel awkward. The front windows were heavily tinted, so you couldn't really see inside. There was a double door entrance with a little vestibule between the outer and inner doors. The moment we stepped inside, I was hit with that distinct smell some stores have when they've existed too long. Old carpet, dust, cheap air freshener, plastic wrapping. The place was quiet, except for faint music playing overhead. Not even normal music either. Some slow, generic instrumental stuff that somehow made everything feel even stranger. Gilbert immediately started wandering the aisles, trying not to look overwhelmed. The store was bigger than either of us expected. Shelves of DVDs, magazines, random novelty items, posters, toys, things hanging on walls that neither of us dared comment on out loud. We tried to act casual, but we were absolutely not casual. Every time another customer walked by, we suddenly became extremely interested in whatever random shelf was nearby. Most of the people inside avoided eye contact completely. There were a couple truck drivers wandering around quietly. One middle-aged guy stood staring at magazine covers with the intensity of someone studying for an exam. Another man rushed through the aisles, grabbing items as quickly as possible like he wanted to escape before anyone recognized him. The entire place had this strange, unspoken atmosphere where everyone pretended nobody else existed. Gilbert picked up random items just to make me laugh. At one point, he nearly dropped something because he was laughing too hard at his own joke. We spent probably 30 or 40 minutes wandering around pretending we weren't deeply uncomfortable. Eventually, we each bought something, mostly because leaving empty-handed somehow felt more embarrassing. The cashier looked completely dead inside. He barely acknowledged us, except to check our IDs quickly before ringing us up. And then we noticed her. At first, I barely paid attention because she was standing near the entrance off to the side. She looked very old, tiny and hunched slightly forward, gray hair, large sunglasses covering her eyes even though it was already evening outside. She held one of those long white walking canes used by blind people. I remember being surprised because an adult video store was probably the last place I expected to see an elderly blind woman. It didn't fit. Everything about it seemed out of place. She wasn't talking to anyone. She just stood there quietly near the front. Gilbert noticed her too, and we exchanged one of those quick, confused looks people make when they both silently acknowledge something weird. Still, we didn't think much of it at first. We headed toward the exit carrying our little plastic bags, trying to get out before Gilbert's brother roasted us too badly for taking so long. As we reached the double-door vestibule, the old woman slowly started moving toward the exit as well. She didn't ask for help. She didn't speak at all. But Gilbert and I automatically did what most people would do. We each grabbed one of the doors and held them open for her. She moved slowly between us, tapping carefully with her cane. "Thank you," she whispered softly. Her voice startled me because it was barely louder than a breath. We stepped outside into the warm evening air. The sun had almost fully set by then, leaving the sky dark blue with streaks of orange near the horizon. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead, attracting clouds of insects. Beyond the glow of the store, everything else faded into darkness. The old woman walked ahead of us at a slow pace, while Gilbert and I headed toward his car, parked a short distance away. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Gilbert climbed into the back seat because he wanted to dig through the stuff we bought and make jokes about it before his brother started driving again. I went to the trunk to shove my purchase deep into my duffel bag, where hopefully nobody would ever accidentally find it. I remember hearing trucks roaring past on the interstate nearby. I remember the warm wind blowing across the parking lot. I remember thinking about how dumb the whole stop had been. Then something caught my attention. The old woman had stopped walking. She was standing near our car. At first I assumed she was confused and trying to find her own vehicle. But then I noticed something strange. She wasn't just standing nearby. She was moving directly toward our passenger side door. Slowly, carefully, her cane tapped the pavement as she approached. I straightened up from the trunk and watched her. She reached out one hand and touched the front passenger door handle. Something about the way she did it immediately made my stomach tighten. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't confused. It looked deliberate. She wrapped her fingers around the handle and pulled. The door was unlocked. But before it could open fully, I shouted, "Gilbert, lock the doors." My voice came out louder and sharper than I intended. Gilbert jumped in the back seat, startled, luckily, because it was his car. He had the key fob in his hand already. He hit the lock button immediately. The car chirped. The old woman froze. Then she pulled the handle again. Locked, she moved to the back passenger door. Pulled again. Locked. Gilbert stared at her through the window with this stunned expression, like his brain couldn't process what was happening. Honestly, mine couldn't either. The old woman just stood there beside the car. Silent, motionless. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Not us. Not her. I remember feeling this horrible crawling sensation in my chest. Not because an old woman touched the car door, but because, suddenly, every instinct in my body was screaming that something wasn't right. She slowly turned her head toward the windows. Even behind the sunglasses, it felt like she was looking directly at. Then, without saying a single word, she turned around and started walking back toward the store. Tap, tap, tap. Her cane clicked softly against the pavement as she disappeared toward the entrance. Gilbert and I just stood there frozen. Neither of us said anything for several seconds. Finally, Gilbert whispered, "What the hell was that?" I honestly had no answer. His older brother rolled down the driver's side window looking annoyed. "What are you idiots doing?" We both started talking at once, trying to explain what had happened. But even while explaining it, it sounded ridiculous. An old blind lady tried opening the car door. That was it. Technically harmless. Technically nothing. But it didn't feel harmless. Because blind or not, She had walked directly to our, not near it, not past it, directly to it, and she went straight for the door handles. Gilbert's brother laughed at first, but even he stopped smiling after seeing how genuinely shaken we were. We got into the car quickly after that and locked the doors immediately. As we started pulling out of the parking lot, I looked back toward the store entrance. The old woman was standing inside the glass vest, perfectly still, facing our direction, watching us leave, or at least it felt like she was. I remember the drive home being strangely quiet after that. Gilbert and I kept trying to come up with explanations, because neither of us wanted to admit how uncomfortable the whole thing made us feel. Maybe she thought it was her ride. Maybe she was confused. Maybe she wasn't actually blind. Maybe she worked there somehow. Eventually, Gilbert joked that maybe she was secretly some kind of parking lot prostitute working lonely truck drivers for extra cash. The idea was so absurd we laughed, but honestly, it still didn't explain her behavior. What stuck with me most was how deliberate she seemed. She didn't wander around searching randomly. She didn't ask for help. She didn't speak after leaving the store. She walked straight to our car and tried the handles calmly, almost like she expected them to open. The older I get, the creepier it feels. At 18, we laughed it off eventually, because that's what teenagers do. But now, years later, I think about how vulnerable people can be at lonely roadside stops, late at night, truck stops, rest areas, empty parking lots along highways where strangers come and go constantly. Maybe she really was harmless. Maybe she was confused. Or maybe she wasn't blind at all. That thought still bothers me sometimes, because right before she turned away from the car, for one brief second, I could have sworn she looked directly at me through those dark glasses. Not vaguely in my direction, directly at me. And there was nothing blind about it. This literally happened to me this evening, and I still can't stop thinking about it. I've tried explaining it to a few people already, but every time I do, it sounds less creepy out loud than it actually felt in the moment. Nothing violent happened. Nobody got hurt. There was no ghost standing in the hallway or some dark figure staring through a window. But the whole thing left me with this horrible, unsettled feeling that I still can't shake. It was one of those moments where your brain suddenly stops trusting what your eyes and ears just told you. It started completely normally. It was early evening, just before dinner, and I was in the kitchen cooking. Nothing exciting, just a regular weekday night at home. My parents were around the house doing their own thing while I handled dinner. I was halfway through making noodles when I realized we'd run out. I remember standing there annoyed, because I'd already started cooking everything else. The water was boiling, ingredients were already chopped, and now the one thing I actually needed was missing. The shop near our house is only a couple of minutes away, just around the corner, so my dad offered to go grab some quickly. It wasn't a big deal. He just casually said he'd be back in a few minutes and headed out the front door. Everything about that moment felt completely normal. I remember hearing the door close. I remember continuing to stir the food while waiting for the noodles. I wasn't really paying attention to anything else because I was focused on cooking. Music was playing quietly from someone's phone in another room, pans were sizzling, and the kitchen smelled like garlic and sauce. Just ordinary household noise. A couple minutes passed. Then I heard movement behind me. I looked up and saw my dad walk into the kitchen. What stands out most clearly in my memory is the yellow jacket. He has this bright yellow jacket he wears sometimes when going outside quickly, especially in the evening. It's impossible to miss. That jacket was the first thing I noticed when he came into the room. He looked completely normal, not blurry, not shadowy, not dreamlike. completely normal. He stepped into the kitchen casually, like someone entering a room they've entered 1,000 times before. I didn't feel startled because nothing about it seemed strange. I didn't even fully turn around at first because there was no reason to. He said something along the lines of, "They didn't have the noodles. I'll be back in a minute." I remember replying with a distracted okay while still cooking. I didn't think anything of it. In my head, the situation made perfect sense. Maybe the first shop didn't have them and he was going somewhere else nearby. I continued cooking, and this is the part that keeps bothering me. I didn't just hear him, I saw him. Clearly, the yellow jacket, his posture, the way he spoke, the way he entered the room. It felt completely real and ordinary. There was nothing dreamlike or distorted about it at all. A few more minutes passed. Then something started feeling odd. I realized I hadn't heard the front door close again. No footsteps, no sound of him leaving. Nothing. At first I ignored it, because when you're at home with family, your brain filters out familiar sounds constantly. People move around the house all the time without you paying attention. But after another minute or two, I finally called out to him. No answer. I assumed he was upstairs or in another room, so I stepped out of the kitchen. That's when I saw the yellow jacket hanging in the hallway, exactly where it always hangs. I stopped dead. I remember staring at it for several seconds because my brain genuinely couldn't process what I was looking at. My first thought was that he must have come back and immediately taken it off without me noticing. But that didn't make sense. I would have heard him. And more importantly, why would he tell me he was going back out for noodles and then just disappear inside the house without saying anything else? I called out again. Still nothing. My stomach started twisting at that point. Not full panic yet, but that horrible creeping feeling that something is wrong in a way you can't explain. I walked into the living room and asked my mum where Dad was. She looked confused and said, "Isn't he back already?" That was the moment the whole situation went from weird to genuinely unsettling. I asked what she meant, and she said she thought she'd heard him come back too. Not clearly enough to have a conversation with him, but enough that she assumed he was home. So now it wasn't just me. That's the part that keeps replaying in my head over and over. If it had only been me, I probably would have brushed it off eventually. Maybe I was distracted while cooking. Maybe I imagined hearing him because I expected him back soon. People zone out all the time. But my mum thought he was back too. Not exactly the same experience, but close enough that it made my skin crawl. We both stood there trying to make sense of it, when, a few moments later, the front door finally opened for real. My dad walked in carrying the noodles. And immediately I noticed something. No yellow jacket. He was wearing completely different clothes from what I remembered seeing in the kitchen. I just stared at him for a second. He asked what was wrong, and I told him what had happened. I explained that he'd already come into the kitchen earlier and said the shop didn't have noodles. I even mentioned the yellow jacket specifically because that detail felt so vivid in my memory. My dad looked genuinely confused. Then he said, "I didn't wear the yellow jacket." I laughed nervously at first because I thought he was joking, but he wasn't. He told me he'd never come back into the house at all. The first shop didn't have the noodles, so he walked farther to another one. That was why he took longer than expected. He never returned home in between, never entered the kitchen, never spoke to me. And according to him, he hadn't even worn the yellow jacket when he left. I remember feeling this sudden cold sensation run through my body. The kind where your stomach drops and everything suddenly feels slightly unreal. Because I know what I saw, or at least I thought I did. I can still picture it perfectly now. Him entering the kitchen, the yellow jacket, his exact words. Even the tone of his voice sounded normal and casual. It wasn't vague. It wasn't like remembering part of a dream. It felt completely real. For the rest of the evening, the atmosphere in the house felt strange. Nobody really knew what to say. We joked about it a little because that's what people do when something unnerving happens, but underneath the jokes there was this uncomfortable tension. I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to figure out if I somehow imagined the entire thing. But how do you vividly imagine someone walking into a room while you're fully awake and cooking dinner? And why did my mum think he was back too? That's the detail that keeps bothering me most. Maybe she only heard a sound outside and her brain filled in the rest because she expected him home soon. That's possible. Human brains are weird like that. We notice patterns. We anticipate familiar events. We think we hear footsteps or voices all the time. But still, the timing of it feels wrong. And I can't explain the yellow jacket. That stupid yellow jacket is burned into my memory so clearly that I can picture the exact shade of it right now. Bright yellow against the kitchen light. I saw it immediately when he entered the room. Except, apparently, he never wore it. Later that night, I actually walked over and touched the jacket hanging in the hallway, because part of me needed to confirm it was real. I know that sounds ridiculous, but the whole thing made me feel disconnected from reality for a while. It's such a small thing compared to most creepy stories people tell. No monster, no ghost, no terrifying figure standing at the foot of the bed, just a normal moment that somehow became deeply wrong. Honestly, I think those are the creepiest experiences, the ones that happen in ordinary places during ordinary moments. Cooking dinner, waiting for someone to come home, seeing a parent walk into the kitchen. Because your home is supposed to feel safe and predictable. Your family is supposed to feel familiar. You trust your own senses in those environments more than anywhere else. So when something happens that completely breaks that trust, even briefly, it sticks with you. What scares me most is how natural it felt at the time. If I had seen some shadowy figure or heard a strange, distorted voice, I would have immediately known something was wrong. But this felt perfectly normal. My brain accepted it instantly. I didn't question it for even a second. That's what unsettles me now. The idea that, for several minutes, I fully believed something had happened that apparently never did. And every time I walk into the kitchen now, part of me remembers turning around and seeing my dad standing there in that yellow jacket, even though he insists he never came home at all. Back when I was in university, I lived in one of those old student houses that clearly wasn't designed to hold a bunch of students. You know the kind of place I mean. Old brick building, strange layout, creaky floors, mismatched doors, and years of people constantly changing things around to squeeze in more bedrooms and rent out every possible bit of space. The house had probably been remodeled a dozen different times over the years, each new landlord trying to turn another room into a rentable bedroom. The layout barely made sense. What had originally been the dining room had been converted into a bedroom long before we moved in. The kitchen had been expanded into the old back room area, which became this awkward communal space where everyone hung out. It wasn't exactly cozy, but it was where we spent most of our evenings, because it was the only room big enough for all of us to sit together comfortably. Like most student houses, it was always a little chaotic. There were dirty mugs everywhere, half-working appliances, random furniture people had found on sidewalks, and walls painted in weird shades from previous tenants who clearly thought they were artistic geniuses after 3 beers. The place constantly smelled faintly of toast, old carpet, and cheap alcohol, no matter how much we cleaned it. But despite all that, I loved living there. There were 6 of us sharing the house all together, and most nights ended the same way. Someone would cook something questionable in the kitchen, while everybody else crowded around the tiny television in the communal room. We'd sit there for hours watching stupid shows, making fun of each other, arguing over whose turn it was to buy toilet paper, and pretending we were working harder in school than we actually were. The night this happened started out exactly like that. It wasn't Halloween. It wasn't storming outside. There were no creepy noises or ghost stories beforehand setting the mood. It was honestly one of the most normal nights imaginable. A few of us were sitting around watching South Park in the communal area. Somebody had ordered takeaway earlier, so empty containers were scattered around the table. One guy was half asleep in an armchair near the wall. Another was trying and failing to roll a cigarette while still laughing at the TV. The room itself was dim, except for the flickering light from the television and the weak yellow glow coming from the kitchen area. I remember feeling unusually relaxed that evening. No assignments due immediately, no exams hanging over us. Just one of those rare nights where everyone was in a good mood and doing absolutely nothing. The communal room was arranged oddly because of how the house had been remodeled. Along one side was a kitchen counter with cabinets underneath, even though that section clearly hadn't originally been part of a kitchen. You could tell by the shape of the room and the awkward placement of everything. The counters looked almost forced into the space, like someone had just decided one day to shove a kitchen where it didn't belong. I was half watching the television and half zoning out when something in the corner of my vision moved. At first, I didn't think anything of it. When you're sitting with a group of people, your brain constantly picks up little movements around you. Someone shifting in a chair, someone walking into the kitchen, shadows moving from the TV light. But this movement caught my attention differently. It was smooth, deliberate, human. I turned my head automatically, expecting to see one of my housemates standing up. Instead, I saw an old man, and to this day I can still picture him perfectly. He wasn't transparent. He wasn't glowing. He didn't appear suddenly like something from a horror movie. He looked completely solid and real. An elderly man was sitting in one of the chairs near the far side of the room, in a spot where none of us had been sitting all night. The strange thing is, I didn't even question his presence at first, because my brain accepted him immediately as a normal person in the room. He looked old-fashioned in a way that immediately stood out once I focused on him. He wore what looked like a long white nightshirt or old-style nightdress, something loose and pale that hung down almost to his ankles. On his head, he either had very long gray hair or one of those old sleeping caps people wore generations ago. Even now, I honestly can't tell which it was, because the image only lasted a few seconds. What I remember most clearly was the movement. He slowly pushed himself up from the chair. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just casually, like someone getting up after dinner. Then he turned and walked away, directly through the kitchen counter. Not around it, not behind it, straight through it. I remember the exact moment my brain caught up to what I was seeing. There was this horrible split second where reality seemed to tear slightly in front of me, because for one moment, everything about him looked completely normal, just an old man standing up from a chair. Then he reached the worktop, and instead of stopping, he passed through it, through the cabinets underneath, through the solid counter itself, and disappeared, just gone. I froze, completely froze. I remember my chest tightening instantly, and every hair on my arms standing up at once. The room suddenly felt freezing cold, even though logically I know the temperature didn't change. Nobody else reacted. That's the part that still unsettles me most. The TV kept playing. Someone laughed at a joke from South Park. One of my housemates grabbed a drink from the fridge. Life continued completely normally, while I sat there staring at the exact spot where this old man had just vanished. At first, I genuinely questioned whether I'd fallen asleep for a second. That was honestly my first thought. Sometimes when you're tired and staring at a flickering screen, your brain can drift for half a second into dreamlike images. But this hadn't felt dreamlike. It had felt sharp, clear, detailed. I can still remember the way the fabric of his nightshirt moved slightly as he stood. I remember the slow, deliberate way he turned. I remember the shape of his shoulders. Most importantly, I remember the overwhelming certainty that I had just watched a real person move across the room. Except people don't walk through kitchen counters. I didn't say anything immediately because I knew how insane it would sound. Instead, I just sat there trying to calm myself down while secretly staring at the area where he'd disappeared. Part of me expected him to come walking back out again, but nothing happened. Eventually, one of my housemates noticed I'd gone quiet and asked if I was all right. I remember hesitating before answering because I was trying to decide whether to say anything at all. Finally, I just asked, as casually as possible, if anyone had walked through the room a minute ago. Everybody looked confused. No? That answer made my stomach sink. I ended up telling them what I'd seen, expecting laughter immediately. And to be fair, most of them did laugh at first. Not in a cruel way, more in the "you're losing your mind" kind of way people react when someone says they've just seen a ghost in a student house while watching cartoons. But even while laughing, a couple of them looked uneasy. Probably because of how serious I was. I wasn't joking. I knew what I'd seen. The weirdest part was how ordinary it felt. If I had seen some terrifying bloody figure standing in the corner, I would have immediately assumed my eyes were playing tricks on me. But this old man looked so natural sitting there that my brain accepted him instantly as part of the room. It wasn't until he walked through the counter that the fear hit me. After that night, I became weirdly aware of the history of the house. Before then, it had just been another crappy student rental. But suddenly, I started noticing details. The strange layout. The old fireplaces that had been sealed over. The uneven floors. The old-fashioned ceiling beams hidden under newer paint. A few weeks later, the landlord happened to stop by for some maintenance, and somehow the conversation drifted toward the age of the house. He mentioned it had been standing for a very long time, and that previous owners had constantly renovated it over the decades. At one point, he showed us a pile of old photographs he'd found in the loft while clearing junk out. Most of them were black and white family photos from decades earlier. Pictures of people standing in front of the house, formal dining photos, old Christmas gatherings, things like that. The second he mentioned old photos, I felt this horrible, nervous excitement. Part of me desperately wanted to see the old man again. Another part absolutely didn't. We all sat around flipping through the photographs while joking about how miserable everyone looked in old pictures. But secretly, I was searching every face carefully. I never found him. Not exactly. There wasn't a single photo where I could point and say, "That's him." But the experience somehow became even creepier because of the conversations that followed. The landlord explained how the room layouts had changed over the years. The communal room we all sat in had originally been the dining room decades ago, before later renovations turned other areas into bedrooms and expanded the kitchen. Then one of my housemates suddenly pointed at the spot where I'd seen the old man rise from the chair. That would have been right where the dining table was, wouldn't it? The landlord nodded, and that sent this cold feeling through me all over again. Because that's exactly where I'd seen him, sitting naturally where someone would sit at a dining table, then standing up and walking away, not reacting to us, not trying to scare us, just doing something ordinary. Almost like he belonged there more than we did. That idea bothered me more than anything else. The fact that whatever I saw didn't feel threatening. He didn't look at me. He didn't acknowledge us at all. It was like we weren't even part of his world for those few seconds. Over time, the story became one of those things we'd occasionally joke about after drinks. Someone would bring up the old guy in the nightdress whenever the house creaked at night. But underneath the jokes, I think everyone was slightly unsettled by it, especially me. Because unlike everyone else, I saw him clearly. And I know what I saw. People can explain away shadows, reflections, sleep deprivation, tricks of light. Maybe that's exactly what happened. Maybe my tired brain combined flickering television light with an old unfamiliar room and created something that wasn't there. But honestly, I don't think so. Because I've hallucinated things before in that normal human way where your brain briefly mistakes a coat for a person or thinks you saw movement in the dark. This wasn't like that at all. This felt real. Solid, detailed. An old man stood up from his chair after what felt like dinner and quietly walked away through a room that no longer existed the way he remembered it. And for a few seconds, somehow, I saw him. Before the next witness tells their story, take a moment to subscribe to Nachtmeier Witness. This channel is for the late hours, when sleep is close, but the mind is still awake enough to notice every sound in the room. New true stories arrive here for anyone drawn to strange encounters, uneasy memories, and nights that never felt normal again. Leave a like if the stories have pulled you in so far. Now, let's return to the darkness. When I was younger, I had this habit of trying to fall asleep before everyone else in the house. I don't really know why I was so obsessed with it, but I remember feeling safer that way. As long as I fell asleep while I could still hear my parents awake somewhere in the house, I felt okay. The sound of the television downstairs, dishes being washed, quiet conversations between my mom and dad, all of it made the house feel normal and alive. But if I stayed awake too long after everyone else had gone to bed, something changed. The house felt different at night once everyone was asleep. Not haunted exactly, just wrong. We lived in a pretty ordinary suburban house at the time. 2 floors, narrow hallway upstairs, kitchen near the back of the house, living room connected to the dining area. During the day, it felt warm and comfortable like any family home. Sunlight through the windows, people moving around, constant noise. But late at night, especially when I was the only one awake, the house felt much bigger than it actually was. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow looked deeper, and every room beyond my bedroom door felt strangely distant. I used to lie in bed listening carefully to the sounds of the house settling, floorboards creaking, pipes ticking softly, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Those were normal sounds, predictable sounds. But then there were the other noises. At first, they were subtle enough that I convinced myself I imagined them. The sound of a cupboard opening downstairs, a crinkling noise like plastic bags move, the refrigerator door opening and closing, cabinets, drawers, tiny movements coming from the kitchen late at night after everyone was already asleep. The strange thing was how normal the sounds were. If you heard them during the day, you wouldn't even notice them. It would just sound like somebody getting a late-night snack. But at 2 or 3 in the morning, when you know everyone in the house is asleep, those same sounds become terrifying. I remember lying frozen in bed listening to them. Sometimes I'd pull the blanket over my head and try to convince myself it was one of my parents downstairs. Maybe my dad grabbing water, maybe my mom cleaning something up before bed. But deep down, I always knew something felt off. The noises never sounded quite right. Too careful, too quiet, almost sneaky. That's honestly the best word for it. Sneaky, like somebody trying not to wake anyone up. I never told my parents because I was embarrassed. I already scared easily as a kid, and I assumed they'd just laugh it off as an overactive imagination. So instead, I developed this weird fear of being the last person awake in the house. I'd rush to bed as soon as my parents started getting ready to sleep. If I heard them shutting off lights downstairs, my anxiety immediately spiked. Because once the house became completely quiet, I knew I'd start hearing those noises again. And almost every time, I did. Rustling, cupboards, the refrigerator, soft footsteps maybe. Just enough sound to keep me terrified, but never enough to fully prove anything. One night stands out more than all the others. I woke up sometime very late, maybe around 2 or 3 in the morning. I don't know exactly what woke me, but the house was completely silent, except for that familiar faint movement downstairs. Crinkle, tap, a cabinet door softly closing. I remember instantly feeling scared before I was even fully awake. The problem was, I desperately needed to use the bathroom, and the bathroom was across the upstairs hallway, directly opposite the staircase leading down toward the kitchen. As a kid, that short walk felt like crossing a horror movie set. I lay there for several minutes trying to convince myself to stay in bed, but eventually I couldn't hold it anymore. So I slowly climbed out from under the blanket and stood there listening. Everything was quiet again. Too quiet. I opened my bedroom door carefully, trying not to make noise. The hallway outside was dark, except for faint moonlight coming through a window near the stairs. The entire upstairs had that strange, cold-feeling houses get late at night. I remember my heart beating ridiculously hard as I stepped into the hallway. The bathroom door was only a few feet away, but before going inside, I glanced toward the staircase, toward the kitchen downstairs, and that's when I saw it. Movement, a shadow passed across the kitchen. Fast, human-shaped, not detailed enough to see clearly, but enough that I instantly knew it wasn't my imagination. Something moved through that room. I froze completely. Even now, I still remember the exact feeling that hit me in that moment. Pure animal panic. The kind that starts in your stomach and shoots through your whole body all at once. I didn't stop to look again. I didn't call out. I practically sprinted into the bathroom, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I remember standing there listening, trying not to cry. Every tiny sound made me jump. I kept imagining footsteps coming up the stairs toward the bathroom door, but nothing happened. After a minute or two, I forced myself to leave the bathroom and run straight back into my bedroom. I jumped into bed, pulled the blanket over my head, and stayed there shaking until I eventually fell asleep from exhaustion. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. Bright sunlight, breakfast smells from the kitchen, my parents acting completely ordinary. Part of me wanted to tell them what I'd seen, but another part already felt stupid for believing it. Daylight has a way of making nighttime fears seem ridiculous. So, I stayed quiet. But the noises continued over the next few weeks. Always late at night. Always downstairs. Always. At some point I started genuinely wondering if someone was getting into the house somehow. But then I'd immediately feel crazy for even thinking it. Who imagines a stranger sneaking into their house repeatedly without taking anything? So I kept trying to ignore it. Then came my cousin's graduation. I remember the day clearly because the whole family was gone for hours. Everybody dressed up nicely, lots of driving around, relatives everywhere, loud restaurants, photographs, speeches. By the time we finally headed home that night, I was exhausted. I actually felt relieved pulling into our driveway because all I wanted was to sleep. But the second we got out of the car, something felt wrong. The front door looked slightly open. Not wide open, just enough. My dad noticed immediately. I remember his entire posture changing. He stopped walking and stared at the house for a second, before telling all of us to stay back. Then he went inside first. A few seconds later, we heard him swear loudly, and my stomach dropped. The house had been robbed, absolutely torn apart. Drawers dumped onto floors, cabinets hanging open, couch cushions thrown everywhere, bedrooms destroyed, closets emptied. It looked like somebody had taken our entire home and shaken it violently. The weirdest part was the kitchen. The kitchen looked exactly like what I'd been hearing at night, cupboards open, food disturbed, things moved around. I remember standing there staring at the mess while this horrible realization slowly settled into my head. For weeks, maybe longer, I had been hearing somebody in our house. Not ghosts, not my imagination. Someone real, someone sneaking through our kitchen while we slept. I still remember the cold feeling that spread through my body when that thought fully hit me. Because suddenly all those nights replayed differently in my mind. The sounds, the movement, the shadow crossing the kitchen. It wasn't some childhood fear, it had been real. Maybe not every single time. Maybe some noises were still just normal house sounds mixed with fear and imagination. But I know at least some of them weren't. And that terrified me more than any ghost story possibly could. The police came, reports were filed, neighbors asked questions, locks were changed. My parents tried to reassure me that it was probably a one-time break-in, but I couldn't stop thinking about those nights beforehand, especially the shadow. To this day, I genuinely believe I saw whoever had been inside our house. Maybe they'd been watching us for a while. Maybe they'd gotten in before. Maybe they knew our routines. That idea still makes my skin crawl. But here's the strangest part. After the robbery, the noises completely stopped. No more cupboards at night. No more crinkling bags. No more refrigerator sounds after everyone went to bed. Nothing. The silence that followed should have made me feel safer, but honestly, it almost made things worse. Because it confirmed what part of me already suspected. Something had been there, and once it finally took what it wanted, it never came back. When I was about 16, a friend of mine and I spent most of our free nights the way small-town teenagers usually do when there isn't much else going on. We weren't getting into serious trouble. We weren't throwing wild parties. We just wanted to get out of the house and feel like we were somewhere bigger than the tiny grid of streets we'd grown up on. So we'd hop on our four-wheelers and head out toward the woods behind town. There was something about riding at night that felt different from riding during the day. In the daylight, everything was familiar. You could see the fields stretching out, the fences, the dirt paths winding through the trees. But at night, those same places felt wider and deeper. The trails seemed to disappear into shadows. The woods felt like they were holding secrets, and when you cut your engines, the silence hit you all at once. That night started like any other. It was late. Late enough that most of the town was asleep. The air had that cool edge it gets once the sun has been gone for a few hours. The sky was clear, and if you tilted your head back, you could see stars scattered between the branches overhead. We rode through trails we knew by heart, weaving between trees, cutting across narrow dirt tracks, and occasionally gunning the engines just to feel the rush. Eventually, we ended up near a spot we both recognized. It was on the edge of a recently harvested cornfield. The corn had been cut not long before, so the field was flat and open, with short, stiff stalks sticking out of the dirt like broken bristles. On one side was the empty field, stretching out into darkness. On the other side was a thick line of woods, dense, black, almost too dark, compared to the open sky above the field. We shut off the four-wheelers at the same time. The engines died, and the sudden silence felt heavy. When you've been surrounded by that loud mechanical hum for so long, The quiet afterward feels unnatural. The kind of quiet where you start noticing small things you would have ignored before. The faint rustle of leaves, insects chirping somewhere in the distance, the soft tick of hot metal cooling down. We decided to take a quick break. We lit cigarettes and leaned against the seats of the four-wheelers. My friend pulled out his phone and called his girlfriend. He paced back and forth a little as he talked, laughing quietly into the phone. I wasn't paying much attention to what he was saying. I was staring toward the tree line, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The woods looked solid from a distance, like one continuous wall of shadow. That's when I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind, a low, rhythmic thumping, faint, steady, coming from somewhere deep inside the woods. I tilted my head slightly, trying to focus on the sound. It wasn't random like branches knocking together. It wasn't scattered like an animal moving through brush. It had rhythm. "Shh," I said. My friend kept talking for another second before I waved at him more urgently. "Be quiet." He gave me an annoyed look, but lowered the phone and stopped mid-sentence. He held it away from his mouth and listened. We both stood still. The sound became clearer once we weren't talking. It was coming from beyond the tree line, not close enough to feel like someone was standing just inside the woods, but not far enough to feel distant either. It was somewhere in that middle space where sound feels real but unreachable. It sounded like drums, not a single drum, multiple beats, repeating in a steady pattern. The closest comparison I can make is to old military-style snare drums, like something you'd hear in a Civil War reenactment. Tight, structured, marching rhythm. But at the same time, there was something deeper underneath it, something that felt more tribal, almost like Native American drumming, a layered pattern that rose and fell in waves. It didn't sound like someone just messing around, it sounded organized. We both heard it clearly, and we both knew there was no reason for it to be there. There were no houses in that direction, no cabins, no camps that we knew of, no events happening that night, just woods and farmland stretching for miles. The rhythm didn't change. It didn't get louder or closer. It just continued at the same steady pace, like it had already been going long before we arrived and would keep going long after we left. I felt my stomach drop when I realized it wasn't just in my head. I looked at my friend. The glow from his phone lit up part of his face. He looked pale, not joking, not smiling. He slowly ended the call with his girlfriend without explaining much. Neither of us laughed. That's how I knew we were both actually scared. Usually, if something weird happened, we'd start messing with each other, make jokes, pretend it was something supernatural just to freak the other one out more. This time, there was no joking. The drums kept going. The woods didn't move. Nothing stepped out. No flashlights appeared. Just that steady, distant rhythm. We didn't talk about going to check it out. Neither of us even suggested it. We both climbed back onto the four-wheelers at almost the same time and started them up. The engines roared to life, drowning out the drumming. The noise felt comforting, like we were breaking whatever spell the silence had cast. We tore down the trail as fast as we could without wiping out. Dirt sprayed behind us. Branches whipped past our shoulders. The ride back felt longer than usual. Every shadow seemed darker. Every dip in the trail felt sharper. We didn't slow down until we saw the lights from my uncle's house up ahead. When we burst inside, we were both talking at once, trying to explain what we'd heard. The rhythm, the direction it came from, how clear it sounded. We expected someone to laugh at us. No one did. Instead, my uncle and a couple of the other adults exchanged a look. The kind of look that says, "We know what you're talking about." They told us they had heard it before, not just once, more than a few times over the years. Late at night, out near the woods and fields. They didn't know what it was either. That part stuck with me more than the sound itself. If they had said it was some nearby group practicing drums, or machinery from a distant farm, or some kind of known explanation, I would have felt embarrassed and moved on. But they didn't have an explanation. Just that sometimes, if you're out there late enough, and the wind is right, you can hear drum. Even now, years later, I can still remember the way that rhythm felt in my chest. The steady thump echoing through the trees, the way the silence wrapped around it, almost protecting it. Nothing chased us. Nothing appeared in the woods. But it didn't belong there. And sometimes that's enough. We never went back to that exact spot at night again. Because sometimes it's not about it's about what you hear in the dark when you know there shouldn't be anyone out there at all. I grew up in Niagara Falls, in a house that felt bigger to me than it probably really was. When you're 4 years old, everything feels large and dramatic. The rooms seem tall, the ceilings high, and the world outside the windows felt endless. The most important part of the house, at least to me, was the huge picture window that overlooked Cayuga Creek. It wasn't a roaring river or anything like that. It was a smaller creek, quiet most of the time, moving steadily along before eventually emptying into the Niagara River and then continuing its journey toward the falls. But to a child, that creek looked mysterious and alive. The window had a wide sill, and that sill was my favorite place in the entire house. I would climb up there and sit cross-legged, pressing my hands and nose against the glass, watching the water move. Sometimes there were birds. Sometimes there were leaves floating past. Sometimes branches would drift along after a storm. I didn't fully understand where the water came from or where it was going, but I knew it never stopped moving. On the day this happened, I was about 4 years old. I remember the light in the room being soft and bright at the same time. It must have been late morning or early afternoon. My mother was in the kitchen behind me, doing something ordinary, like washing dishes or preparing food. The house felt normal, calm, safe. I was playing on the windowsill like I always did, making up stories in my head while staring out at the creek. That's when I noticed him. On the other side of the creek, a man appeared. He walked slowly down the slope toward the water's edge. I don't remember hearing anything unusual, no shouting or loud sounds. It was quiet. The only thing that caught my attention was how bright he looked against the darker background of trees and mud. He was wearing white pants and a white shirt. Even at 4 years old, I noticed how clean and bright his clothes looked. They almost glowed in the sunlight. He walked carefully down to the water. I remember thinking he must be looking for something. Maybe he dropped something. Maybe he was fishing. Maybe he was exploring. I didn't know. Then he did something that confused me. He took off his shirt. He folded it neatly and placed it on the shore. Then he took off his pants and folded them just as neatly, laying them in a small pile. The way he folded them stuck with me. It wasn't messy. It wasn't rushed. It looked careful. That detail is something I still remember clearly, even though so many other parts are blurry. After placing his clothes down, he stepped into the creek. The water wasn't very deep there. It was cloudy from silt and sediment, brownish and thick-looking. It probably reached about 3 or 4 feet at its deepest in that area. From my angle at the window, I could see him clearly as he moved further into the water. Then he leaned forward and put his face into the water. At first, I thought he was looking for something under the surface. That made sense in a child's mind. Maybe he dropped a ring. Maybe he lost something shiny. I didn't understand that what I was seeing was something else entirely. I climbed down from the windowsill and walked into the kitchen where my mother was. I remember tugging at her, or simply speaking up in that simple, straightforward way young children do. "There's a man in the creek," I told her. "He took off his clothes." I don't remember her exact words, I just remember the way she reacted. She walked quickly to the front window to look outside. I followed her gaze, watching her face instead of the creek. I saw all the color drain from her cheeks. It was like someone had flipped a switch. One second she looked normal, the next she looked pale and frozen. Her expression changed in a way that I had never seen before. She didn't explain anything to me. She didn't crouch down to my level or tell me what was happening. Instead, she yelled at me, "Go play." It wasn't gentle, it was sharp and urgent. Then she ran outside. I didn't understand why she was upset. I wasn't in trouble. I had only told her what I saw. But her fear, even if I didn't understand it, was contagious. Something felt wrong. I went back to the picture window. The man was no longer standing upright. He was floating face down in the water. He wasn't moving. The water moved around him, but he didn't move with it in the way living people do. He was just there, floating, still. His clothes were still neatly folded on the shore, untouched. I remember staring at him and waiting. I wanted him to stand up and shake water out of his hair. I wanted him to walk back to his clothes, but he didn't. I didn't know the word dead. I didn't understand what drowning meant, but something inside me felt heavy and confused. My chest tightened. Tears started running down my face, but I didn't know exactly why I was crying. It was like my body understood something my mind couldn't. I stood there, small hands pressed against the glass, watching. The fire department was only 2 blocks away from our house. I don't know if my mother called them or if someone else did. All I know is that within minutes, I heard sirens. The sound felt loud and sharp, cutting through the quiet of the neighborhood. Red lights flashed outside. I stayed at the window. I watched everything. A firefighter walked down toward the creek. He was alone at first. He carried a long pole with a hook at the end. I didn't know what it was for. I didn't understand its purpose. He stepped into the water carefully. The water rippled around his boots as he moved closer to the floating body. He used the hook to catch the man's clothing, or maybe his arm. I can't remember exactly where it latched on, but I remember the motion clearly. He pulled. The body shifted in the water. As he dragged the man toward the shore, the body kept turning in slow circles. The current pushed it gently. The firefighter would hook it, pull it closer, and then lose his grip as it rotated away from him. Then he would hook it again, over and over. I remember thinking the firefighter was hurting him. In my 4-year-old mind, the man wasn't completely gone. I thought maybe he could still feel what was happening. I thought maybe he was uncomfortable. I didn't understand that he was beyond feeling anything at all. The firefighter finally managed to drag him fully to the shore. I don't remember what happened next in clear detail. There were more firefighters, more movement, adults talking. But the image that stays with me most vividly is the slow turning of the body in the water and the repeated hooking motion. Eventually, my mother came back into the house. Her face looked tight and strained, but she didn't cry in front of me. She didn't sit down and explain what I had seen. She didn't ask how I felt. She just went back to whatever she had been doing in the kitchen before, as if nothing had happened. She didn't say one word to me about it that day. Not one. And she never said a word about it any other day either. I was left alone with what I had seen. I went back to the windowsill. I don't know why. Maybe it was habit. Maybe I didn't know where else to go. I remember sitting there quietly for a long time. I cried, but I didn't know why I was crying. It wasn't like when you fall and scrape your knee. It wasn't sharp pain. It was something heavier, something confusing. I felt sad for the man. even though I didn't know him. I felt afraid in a way I couldn't name. The creek kept moving as it always did. The water didn't care what had happened. It continued on its path toward the river and the falls. For a long time after that day, I kept replaying the image in my mind. The white clothes folded neatly, the way he stepped into the water calmly, the stillness, the circling body. But nobody ever helped me process it. No one explained that sometimes people feel so much pain inside that they make choices children cannot understand. No one explained that it wasn't my fault for seeing it. No one explained that death can happen quietly and suddenly. My mother's silence made it feel almost unreal, like maybe I imagined it, like maybe it wasn't important enough to talk about. But it was important. It shaped something in me. When you are 4 years old, you're not supposed to understand the weight of a human life ending. You're supposed to be worried about toys and snacks and cartoons. But instead, I stood at a window and watched a man disappear from the world. The memory never completely left me. As I grew older, I understood more. I learned what drowning meant. I learned what suicide. I began to understand why my mother's face had lost all its color that day. She had known immediately what I didn't. Maybe she was in shock. Maybe she didn't know how to talk about something like that with a child so young. Maybe pretending nothing happened was her way of protecting both of us. But children don't forget. Even when they don't have the words, they remember. To this day, whenever I see a creek or a quiet stretch of water, part of me goes back to that windowsill. I see the sunlight reflecting off white fabric. I see careful folding hands. I see still water. And I remember standing there, crying without knowing why, wishing with all my heart that the man would simply stand up and walk back. After my divorce, I moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment with my 2 kids. It wasn't anything special. In fact, it was pretty run down. The carpet was thin and worn in places, the kitchen cabinets didn't close properly unless you pushed them just right, and the walls had that faded-off white color that never really looks clean no matter how much you scrub it. But it was ours. It was quiet. It was affordable. And at that point in my life, that was enough. The apartment complex sat not too far from a cemetery. You couldn't see the headstones directly from our patio, but you knew it was there. The road curved behind the buildings and led up a small hill lined with old trees, and beyond those trees was the cemetery. It wasn't huge, but it was old enough to feel heavy and silent when you drove past it. I didn't think much about it at first. My son was 4 years old at the time. He was imaginative, bright, and sensitive. He loved to tell stories and had the kind of mind that could turn a cardboard box into a spaceship in seconds. So when he first mentioned he had a friend, I didn't think anything of it. Lots of kids have imaginary friends. It's common, it's normal, but his friend was different. He had a strange name. I wish I could remember it now. It wasn't a normal name like Tommy or Jake. It was something unusual, almost hard to pronounce. My son would say it so casually, like this was someone he saw every day. He described this friend in detail. He has green hair, my son would say matter-of-factly. Green hair. At first I smiled and nodded. Kids imagine wild things. That didn't bother me. But then he started saying this friend lived that way. And every time he said it, he would point toward the direction of the cemetery. That made me pause. Where does he live? I asked once. That way, he repeated, pointing past the patio doors toward the hill. Does he have a house? He shook his head. No, he just lives there. There was something about the way he said it that didn't sound like make-believe. It didn't sound playful. It sounded certain. Then he began telling me that this friend pinched him. He pinches me, he said one afternoon, rubbing his arm. "Why does he pinch you?" "Because he wants me to play." I checked his arms. I didn't see bruises, but I did see small red marks once or twice. At the time, I told myself it was normal kid stuff. He could have bumped into something. He could have pinched himself. 4-year-olds are not exactly careful. Still, something in my stomach felt uneasy. The part that really started to get to me was the patio blinds. Our patio door led out to a small concrete slab with a railing around it. The door was solid. When it was shut, it sealed tightly. There were vertical blinds hanging in front of it, the kind that shift and clack together if there's a breeze. But there were times when those blinds would move even though there was no breeze. No windows open, no air conditioning running, nothing. They would sway slightly, like someone had brushed past them. The first time it happened, I assumed it was air pressure from another door closing somewhere in the building. Apartments make strange noises. Buildings settle. I brushed it off. But then my son would say, "He's here," right when the blinds moved. Or he would say, "He left," and the blinds would shift again. It happened more than once. I told myself it was coincidence. It had to be coincidence. I refused to let my mind go anywhere else. Life after divorce was already stressful enough. I wasn't about to start convincing myself that something unnatural was happening in my crappy little apartment. Still, the feeling lingered. One night my ex was visiting. We were putting our son to bed together. The room was dim, lit only by a small lamp on the dresser. As I tucked him in, I noticed chalk drawings on his closet wall. They weren't huge, just simple shapes and lines. Since it was chalk, I wasn't furious. It would wipe off. But I did remind him gently that we don't draw on walls. "What are these?" I asked him. He pointed. "That one is a gate." "A gate?" I said. "Yeah, it keeps the bad ones out." My ex and I looked at each other. "And what about that one?" I asked, pointing to another shape. "That's a cross," he said calmly. "It lets the good ones in." There was no hesitation in his voice, no giggling, no sense that he was making it up on the spot. He sounded like he was explaining something obvious. My ex asked, "What bad ones?" My son shrugged. "Just bad ones." I felt my skin prickle. We didn't talk about spirits or ghosts in our house. We weren't especially religious. He didn't watch scary movies. He wasn't exposed to anything that would explain that kind of language in that context. After we left his room, I remember standing in the hallway for a moment in silence. My ex brushed it off more easily than I did. "Kids say weird stuff," he said. And yes, they do. But there was a pattern forming that I couldn't ignore. Another time, I found him sitting at the kitchen table playing with dried peanut butter. He had smeared it onto a piece of cardboard and was pressing little blocks into it, like he was building something. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I'm making mortar," he said. "Mortar?" I laughed a little. "What's mortar?" "That stuff you build houses out of." I stared at him. "How do you know what mortar is?" He didn't even look up at me. He just kept pressing the cardboard pieces into the peanut butter. "I used to build houses," he said simply. The way he said it made the air feel heavy. "You used to?" I repeated. "Yeah," he nodded. Before what?" I wanted to ask, but I didn't. There was something about the certainty in his voice that scared me more than if he had said it in a silly way. It didn't feel like pretend. It felt like remembering. I didn't know what to do with that. Over time, the comments continued. The green-haired friend, the cemetery direction, the pinching, the blinds moving. There were nights when I would lie awake after putting the kids to bed, listening to the sounds of the apartment. Every creak of the building felt louder. Every shifting noise felt meaningful. Sometimes I would stand in the living room and stare at the patio door, watching the blinds. Waiting, there were moments when they moved slightly, and I would tell myself it was air pressure, temperature changes, anything logical. I refused to let my mind wander too far. But the truth is, I was unsettled. Not because I believed something supernatural was happening, but because I didn't understand what my son was experiencing. Children have vivid imaginations. They blend fantasy and reality easily. That's normal. But this felt structured, detailed, persistent. He would sometimes speak about his friend in a protective tone, like he needed to defend him. "He's not bad," he told me once. "Who?" "My friend. He's just lonely, lonely." The word broke my heart for reasons I couldn't fully explain. Was my son lonely? Was this his way of coping with the divorce? With the move? With the change in routine? That explanation made sense. 4-year-olds don't process big life changes the way adults do. Maybe he created someone who lived nearby, someone who visited through the patio, someone who needed him as much as he needed someone. But then there were the small red marks on his arms again one day. He pinched me. He insisted. Why? Because I wasn't listening. I didn't know whether to discipline him for blaming imaginary things or to comfort him. Eventually, as time went on, the comments became less frequent. The green-haired friend stopped visiting as much. The blinds moved less often, or maybe I just stopped noticing. We eventually moved out of that apartment. Life continued. Years passed. My son grew older, and he stopped talking about the friend entirely. I asked him once, gently, when he was maybe 8 or 9, "Do you remember your friend with green hair?" He looked confused. No, he had no memory of it. None. The gate drawing, the cross, the mortar, the cemetery, nothing. Part of me felt relief. Another part of me felt something else, a quiet unease that I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was all imagination. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was childhood creativity mixing with environmental cues. Or maybe some things don't need clear explanations. All I know is that during that chapter of my life, in that small, worn-out apartment near the cemetery, my 4-year-old son spoke about things he shouldn't have known, described a friend no one else could see, and watched blinds move when there was no breeze. And even now, years later, when I think about dried peanut butter pressed into cardboard and a little voice calmly saying, "I used to build houses," I still feel that same quiet chill settle into my chest. My uncle told me this story during the holidays last year, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. It wasn't the kind of story that explodes with action or ends with something jumping out of the shadows. There were no screams, no blood, no dramatic twists. It was calm, simple, almost quiet. And maybe that's exactly why it has stayed with me the way it has. It didn't feel like a performance. It felt like a memory. He told it late at night after everyone else had gone to bed. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of wind brushing against the windows. We were sitting at the kitchen table with only one light on, the kind that leaves the corners of the room slightly dim. Outside the windows, everything was black. You couldn't see the yard, just your own reflection staring back at you. It felt like the world had shrunk down to that small pool of yellow light around the table. He wasn't trying to scare me. He wasn't leaning forward or lowering his voice for effect. He just started talking, the way older relatives do when they drift into old memories. He said he must have been 13 or 14 when it happened. Back then, he was living in Mexico in a small town where everybody knew each other. Not the kind of place filled with traffic and noise, but somewhere quieter, slower. The streets were dusty. The houses were simple. Nights were dark in a way that people who grow up in big cities might never really experience. When the sun went down, it really went down. No glowing skyline, no streetlights on every corner, just open sky and whatever light the moon decided to give. He said that in those days, kids didn't stay inside much. There were no smartphones, no endless TV channels. After school and chores, you went outside. You ran around. You kicked a ball. You made your own fun. There was an open field not too far from where he lived. It wasn't a real soccer field with lines painted on the ground. It was just flat land where grass struggled to grow and dust rose with every step. Beyond that field were low hills that stretched into the darkness. One evening, he and his friends were out there playing soccer after dark. I remember interrupting him when he said that. I asked why they were playing at night. He just shrugged and said it was normal. The air was cooler then, the ground wasn't as hot. And when you're young, you don't really think about danger the way adults do. You just want to keep playing. He described the night as calm. The sky was clear. The moon gave off enough light to see shapes and movement, though not details. Their voices carried easily in the open space. You could hear laughter echoing slightly. Dust puffed up around their feet as they ran. It was just a normal evening, boys chasing a ball and shouting at each other. Then, something shifted. He said he doesn't remember who noticed it first. One of the boys must have slowed down and stared toward the hills. At first, nobody else paid attention. But then someone said, "What's that?" And the tone of his voice made the others look. Above one of the hills, there were small lights. Not high in the sky like stars. Lower, closer, they weren't steady white either. Some looked slightly bluish. Others had a yellow or green glow. They didn't flicker like distant houses. They hovered. My uncle said at first they tried to explain it away. Maybe someone was walking with flashlights. Maybe it was a vehicle. Maybe it was hunters. But there were no roads on those hills. No houses. Nothing that should have produced lights like that. The dots moved, slowly at first, then drifting sideways, then rising slightly before settling again. He said the strangest part was how quiet everything became. Not because the lights made a sound. They didn't. It was just that the boys stopped talking all at once. The laughter faded. The ball rolled to a stop and nobody chased it. They were all just staring. Then one of his friends spoke. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He said calmly but firmly, "Run ahead. Don't look back. Just run." There was something in his voice that made the others listen without question. My uncle said that normally, if someone told them to run, there would have been teasing, or at least confusion. But not that night. They ran. They didn't grab the ball. They didn't argue. They didn't even look back. They just ran. He said they ran harder than they ever had before. Their feet pounded against the dry ground. Dust filled the air behind them. Their breathing turned sharp and ragged. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He said it felt like something was behind them, even though he never turned to confirm it. About a mile away, there was another small town. They didn't stop until they reached it. By then, their legs were shaking. Their chests burned. They bent over, gasping for air. When they finally gathered themselves, my uncle asked the friend who had told them to run why he had said that. The boy looked pale and shaken. He said, "Those were brujas, witches, in many parts of Mexico. Brujas aren't just Halloween decorations or fairy tale villains. They're part of local stories that are told seriously. Stories about women who turn into lights, who float above hills at night, who move silently through the sky. They aren't always described as evil in a dramatic way, but they are dangerous. Unpredictable." My uncle said he wasn't someone who easily believed in those things. Even as a teenager, he didn't spend time worrying about spirits or folklore. But he said what they saw didn't move like car lights. It didn't move like lanterns. It drifted in patterns that felt deliberate. He emphasized that word when he told me. Deliberate, like the lights were choosing where to go. He said the worst part wasn't even the lights themselves. It was the feeling that washed over all of them at the same time. A deep, instinctive fear that didn't need explanation. The kind of fear that makes your body act before your mind can catch up. I asked him if maybe it was just mass panic. Maybe one boy got scared and the others followed. He shook his head slowly. No, he said. We all felt it. He told me that even now, when he goes back to visit family in Mexico, he sometimes sees lights on distant hills at night. Not every night, not close enough to touch, but far away, small glowing dots moving slowly in the dark. He doesn't chase them. He doesn't investigate. He just notices them and looks away. When he said that, something tightened in my chest, because this wasn't just a childhood story he could laugh off. He still sees them. I tried to offer logical explanations. Maybe hikers, maybe farmers checking land, maybe someone driving off-road. He listened, nodded politely, and then said, "There are no roads there, and they don't move like cars." He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince me. He just said it the way someone states a fact about the weather. That calmness made it worse. If he had sounded excited or dramatic, I could have dismissed it as exaggeration, but he spoke like he was describing something ordinary that just happens to exist outside explanation. After he finished, the kitchen felt smaller somehow. The single light above us seemed dimmer. I remember glancing toward the window and feeling uncomfortable seeing only darkness beyond the glass. I think what unsettles me most is not the idea of witches specifically. It's the idea of the way those boys didn't debate or hesitate. The way one voice said run, and everyone obeyed. There's something ancient about that kind of reaction. Something built deep into us. We like to believe we need proof before we fear something. But sometimes the body recognizes danger long before the mind understands it. Even now, when I step outside at night and see a distant light in the dark, I think about that feel, about dust rising under running feet, about colored dots hovering above a hill with no road. I think about not looking back. And I understand why that part of the story stayed with me the most. Not the lights themselves, but the running, the certainty, and the quiet agreement between a group of boys that whatever was out there, it was not something they wanted to face. My father came to Europe by boat when he was young. He was proud of that story and told it often, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, steady way that made you understand how much it meant to him. Even after settling into life and building something stable for himself, he never stopped feeling connected to where he came from. Every year, no matter how busy life got, he made it a point to go back to Belgium to visit family. It wasn't just a vacation to him, it was something deeper. It was returning to roots. Naturally, once he had the means to travel more comfortably, he began bringing me and my sister along. For us, those trips felt like adventures. We got to see places most of our friends only read about in school. Old towns, narrow streets, buildings older than our entire country, churches and cathedrals that felt impossibly huge when you stood inside them. One year, after visiting family in Belgium, my father decided we would take a few days and travel to Prague. He said it almost casually over breakfast one morning, like it was no big deal. But to us, it was huge. Prague sounded mysterious even before we got there. The name alone felt old and heavy with history. When we arrived, the city felt like something pulled from a storybook. Cobblestone streets, towers and spires rising into the sky. The kind of architecture that makes you feel small in the best possible way. Everywhere you looked, there was history pressing in from every side. One of the places my father insisted we visit was St. Vitus Cathedral. He had read about it before and said it was one of the most important landmarks in the city. When we approached it, I remember tilting my head back just to take it all in. The cathedral was massive, with dark stone rising high above us. The details carved into the exterior looked almost unreal, like lace made from rock. Gargoyles clung to the edges. Tall stained glass windows caught the inside. It felt even larger. The ceilings stretched so high they almost disappeared into shadow. Light filtered through stained glass in deep reds and blues, painting the stone floors with color. The air felt cool and still, like it had been preserved that way for centuries. While we were there, we found out that the crypt below the cathedral was open to visitors that day for a special event. It wasn't always open, and that made it feel like an opportunity we shouldn't pass up. My father suggested we go down and see it. The entrance to the crypt was narrower and darker than the main cathedral. As we descended, the air changed. It grew cooler and slightly damp. The noise from the main floor faded behind us, replaced with a low murmur of voices echoing against stone. When we reached the crypt, it was crowded. More crowded than we expected. People were packed tightly together, slowly shuffling forward in lines to see the coffins of former kings and important figures. I don't remember exactly which king's coffin we were looking at. At the time, the name didn't mean much to me. It was just history, something distant and hard to connect to. But the atmosphere down there felt different. The lighting was dim and uneven. Shadows clung to corners. The stone walls felt thick and heavy. There was a sense of weight in the room, like the past was pressing in from every direction. As we made our way toward the front, pushing gently through the crowd, I started noticing something strange. People around us were muttering in frustration. I heard someone say their camera wasn't working. Another person complained that their photo came out completely white. Someone else said their camera screen had gone black. At first, I didn't think much of it. Cameras malfunction. Batteries die. Memory cards get corrupted. It happens. But it wasn't just one person. It was several. A woman near us kept trying to take a photo, but her screen stayed blank. A man shook his camera and turned it off and on again. Someone else said their camera had stopped responding altogether. My father shrugged and said maybe it was the lighting or something about the environment down there interfering with electronics. When we finally reached the front, my sister raised her camera and took a few photos. She took 3 in total. Each time, the camera seemed to work fine. The screen displayed the image clearly. No strange flickering, no error messages. We didn't see anything unusual at the time. The coffin looked as expected. Stone, carved details, historical inscriptions. The crowd pressed in around us. There was definitely no one standing next to the coffin. No guards, no reenactors, no staff dressed in period clothing. We eventually made our way back up into the main cathedral and then out into the daylight. The brightness outside felt almost blinding after the dim crypt. The rest of the day passed normally. We walked around the city, took more pictures, ate dinner, and returned to our hotel. That night, my sister decided to upload her photos onto her laptop. She sat on the bed scrolling through them while I leaned over her shoulder. Most of the pictures were exactly what you would expect. Stained glass windows, the cathedral's interior, crowds of people. Then she opened the photos from the crypt. The first one loaded. At first glance, it looked normal. The coffin was there, the stone walls behind it. But then my sister leaned closer. There wasn't anyone standing there, she said quietly. I looked more carefully. Standing next to the coffin was a figure in a full suit of armor. It wasn't blurry, it wasn't faint. It was clearly visible. A man in metal armor, holding what looked like a halberd. The armor looked polished, but old-fashioned. The halberd was upright, like he was guarding the coffin. But I knew for a fact there had been no one standing there when the photo was taken. We opened the second picture. He was there again, Same position, same armor, same halberd. The third photo showed the same thing. 3 separate images, same figure. We sat in silence for a moment. My father came over when he noticed we weren't speaking. He looked at the screen. He frowned. "There wasn't anyone dressed like that down there," he said. We all agreed on that. The crypt had been crowded, yes, but there was no guard in historical armor standing beside the coffin. If there had been, it would have been obvious. We zoomed in on the image. The figure wasn't transparent or ghostly. It looked solid, real, like someone physically present in the room. But he hadn't been there. About an hour later, my sister's laptop froze. At first, we thought it was just slow. But then the screen went black. It wouldn't restart properly. Error messages popped up. It refused to boot. My sister, all her photos from the trip were on that computer. We tried restarting it multiple times. Nothing worked. The next morning, it was completely unresponsive. When we returned home from vacation, my father brought the laptop to the tech guy at his work. The man was experienced. He said he would try to recover whatever data he could. A few days later, he called. He had managed to recover everything from the laptop. All the photos, all the documents, everything except the 3 pictures from the crypt. Those were gone, completely missing, not corrupted, not damaged. Gone, the folders where they should have been were empty. The tech guy said sometimes files become unrecoverable due to corruption or overwriting. It wasn't impossible. It just wasn't common for only 3 specific files to disappear while everything else was restored perfectly. We never saw those images again. Even now, when I think back to that day in the crypt, I remember the feeling more than anything. The heavy air, the strange camera malfunctions around us, the quiet way that armored figure stood beside the coffin in all 3 photos. I don't know what we captured. I don't know why other cameras failed while my sister's worked. I don't know why her computer crashed shortly after. And I don't know why those 3 specific images were the only things that couldn't be recovered. I'm not someone who jumps quickly to believing in ghosts. I like explanations. I prefer logic. But sometimes there are moments that don't fit neatly into logic. And whenever I think of that dim crypt beneath St. Vitus Cathedral, I can't help but picture a silent figure in armor, standing guard over a coffin, appearing only in photographs, and then disappearing completely, as if he had never been there at all. The stories may be over, but some nights do not end when the video does. The people you heard tonight were not looking for fear. They were living normal lives until one moment changed the way they saw the world around them. Tell me in the comments which story stayed with you the longest. Subscribe to Nachtmeier Witness for more true accounts from people who saw something they wish they could forget. Good night, and if you wake up suddenly, do not assume it was just a dream.